I'm so austere. I stayed up all night, chanted rounds while all you sense gratifiers were sleeping. Jagannath ki jai. It's hard to see. You just have to see me. Yeah. So what would be the point of that austerity? And also, Prabhupada describes, maybe it'll come up here, sometimes people do fasting. It's totally in the mode of ignorance. It's just torturing, they're doing austerity for for political purposes. So that way austerity can be detrimental. Krishna conscious person observes fasting as is recommended in scripture. He does not fast or eat more than required. Thus he is competent to perform yoga. One who eats more than required will dream very much while sleeping. And he must consequently sleep more than is required. One should not sleep more than 6 hours daily. Or 7. There's another purport. There's another purport. You get 7 in the other purport. As far as I remember, you get 7 in the other purport. One who sleeps more than 6 hours out of 24 is certainly influenced by the mode of ignorance. A person in the mode of ignorance is lazy and prone to sleep a great deal. Such a person cannot perform yoga. So, Prabhupada was not fond of sleeping personally, and he wasn't really fond of his disciples sleeping more than they had to. So maybe 6 hours is enough for you, maybe for somebody 5, maybe someone needs 7, 7.5. But the principle is not to sleep more than you need. And the principle of this verse is to say, when does something become sense gratification? When does sleep become, at what hour does sleep become sense gratification? At 6 hours and 1 minute, every minute after 6, it's sense gratification? Or at what point does eating become sense gratification? At that point when you've had enough and then you eat that gulab jamun, is that gulab jamun sense gratification? And before that it was honoring prasadam? Well, kind of like that. Because that question's going to come up. How do I know what is sense gratification? When you take more than enough, it starts, like you're eating more than you need. You ever eat more than you need to eat? That ever happened to you? Why? Because prasadam's good. When it's not good, you usually don't overeat. But when it's good, you overeat. So, every bite that you overeat is, I think it's called overeating, right? And so Krishna's saying, not good, you eat too much. And so Prabhupada gave many lectures. He said, well, you have to control your tongue. You have to control your belly. Then if you control your tongue and belly, your sexual desire will be controlled. So, there is a problem of eating and sleeping too much, definitely. And if you don't believe me, try to sleep 10 hours a day for a week. Amazingly, one of my godbrothers said that Prabhupada said oversleeping was worse than anything else. That any of the other negative principles, oversleeping was more damaging. Something like that, I can't say. You're saying, oh, you mean it's worse than eating meat, it's worse than illicit sex, it's worse than intoxication. That's what he told me, Prabhupada said. That oversleeping is more damaging than anything. Firmly fixed in ignorance. But that's something to consider. So at least for the sake of this discussion, this topic, we can say, as a general principle, more than you need is sense gratification. And less than you need is undue austerity. And both sides are bad. I'm chanting 64 rounds a day, yeah. But that's great. But actually chant nicely. Don't meditate on sense gratification while you're chanting. What's the point? Right? You need to, if you're chanting 64 rounds and you're meditating on sense gratification, you need to stop chanting and do something. Engage your mind and senses. So that kind of austerity would be too much for you. Right? It wouldn't be helpful. Let's read the next verse. You probably have heard this verse. It's also quite famous. Yukta Hari Viharasya, Yukta Chaita Sakramasya, Yukta Swapnapabodasya, Yoga Bhavati Dukkha. He who has regulated his habits of eating, sleeping, recreation, and work can mitigate all material pains by practicing the yoga system. Extravagance in the matter of eating, sleeping, and defending and mating, which are demands of the body, can block advancement in the practice of yoga. As far as eating is concerned, it can be regulated only when one is practiced to take and accept prasadam, sanctified food. Lord Krishna is offered according to Bhagavad Gita vegetables, fruits, flowers, grains, milk, etc. In this way, a person in Krishna consciousness becomes automatically trained not to accept food not meant for human consumption or not in the category of goodness. As far as sleeping is concerned, a Krishna conscious person is always alert in the discharge of his duties in Krishna consciousness. And therefore, any unnecessary time spent sleeping is considered a great loss. Yes, Prabhupada, he didn't like sleeping. You know why? Because he thought sleeping was a complete waste of time. He couldn't be engaged. He really didn't like it. And there was a point when Prabhupada's health was not good, and he couldn't sleep. He'd be up at night and he couldn't sleep. And he was actually happy that he couldn't sleep. Isn't that interesting? He was, I think it was associated, as far as I understand, with his declining health. And he was so happy that he couldn't sleep. And his digestion wasn't good and he couldn't eat much. And he was happy that he couldn't eat. Can you imagine you couldn't eat? How miserable you would be? You couldn't sleep, how miserable you would be? The Prabhupada was happy. Isn't that interesting? Yes? You find that interesting? And he told one of his disciples, when he couldn't sleep and eat, that one of his desires, his long-term desires, was to be able to give up eating, sleeping, mating, and defending. That's liberated, just totally out of the body. So when his health was causing him to not be able to sleep or eat well, he said, this is what I always desired. And now it's happening. So he was happy. Interesting, right? Have you ever had this thought, what if I couldn't eat? What would I do? Could you imagine? Like, the rest of your life you're just going to be fed intravenously and you can't eat anymore. Just that thought makes me cry. It's like, wow, I don't think I could live like that. No more subsies, no more puris, no more sweet. You can't eat anymore. Wow. Isn't it? It's a morbid thought. Unless you're advanced, then you think, oh, that'd be great. Same time. Jagannath Swami ki jai. Right? Fantastic. I don't have to go shopping. I don't have to cook. I don't have to waste time eating. I don't have to go to the toilet. Fantastic. Liberated. So that's how Prabhupada felt. Interesting, right? Yeah. Avyartha kalatvam. A Krishna conscious person cannot bear to pass a minute in his life without being engaged in the service of the Lord. Therefore, his sleeping is kept to a minimum. His ideal in this respect is Srila Rupa Goswami, who was always engaged in the service of Krishna and who could not sleep more than 2 hours a day, and sometimes not even that. So his energy was not coming from the physical plane. It's coming from the spiritual plane. So that's how he could do it. Don't try this at home. 2 hours a night, especially if you are driving a car or a motorcycle. Very dangerous. If you did that, you could probably fall asleep driving a motorcycle. It's possible. Thakur Haridas would not even accept prasadam nor even sleep for a moment without finishing his daily routine of chanting with his beads, 300,000 names. As far as work is concerned, a Krishna conscious person does not do anything which is not connected with Krishna's interest, and thus his work is always regulated and untainted by sense gratification. Since there is no question of sense gratification, there is no material leisure for a person in Krishna consciousness. A devotee has leisure, but it's not material. And there's a story. It's a really interesting story. I don't know the exact details, but a devotee was suggesting to Prabhupada a schedule. You do this at this time, and you do this at this time, like very regulated. And of course, Prabhupada had a regulated schedule, but apparently this was like too much, like every minute of the day was accounted for. And he said he couldn't do that, it was unnatural. And he said, sometimes I write, sometimes I'll read, sometimes I'll do bhajan. So for Prabhupada, his recreation was doing bhajan or reading his books. So, you might wonder when Krishna says recreation, does he mean Disneyland? Because Prabhupada's saying, no, that's not what he means. Yeah. Okay. Next Sunday is football day. Because Krishna says recreation. So there'll be no lecture. And down at the field over here, football. And that way we'll be following Krishna's instructions for recreation. So, Prabhupada's saying recreation, but not recreation that's sense gratification. But we go on parikrama, you go to Mayapur, you go to Vrindavan, you go to Kirtan, you learn bhajans, things like that. You could learn to cook. That's our recreation, right? Yes. You agree? Or you don't know? You're thinking about it. Yeah. Since there's no question of sense gratification, there's no material leisure for a person in Krishna consciousness. And because he is regulated in all his work, speech, sleep, wakefulness, and all other bodily functions, there is no material misery. So, we've been speaking on this topic for, I think this is my 3rd week. I give classes Saturday and Sunday evenings online. And this idea of sense gratification, in a sense, doesn't exist in the life of a devotee. Because let's say you're sleeping. Why are you sleeping? So you can get up and play football tomorrow? No. So you can get up and chant your rounds and do service. So you can't really say you're sleeping is sense gratification. Even though it feels like it, right? You're tired, you go to sleep, it feels good. But the thing is, you get up early in the morning to chant your rounds. And so you're sleeping solely to maintain the body. So our sense gratification is not sense gratification. And you say, but Prabhu, what about getting married and having children? Isn't that sense gratification? It is, but we don't do it unrestrictedly. And we do it to bring children into the world. So it's not really sense gratification, because nobody does that, right? How many people do the proper samskars before conceiving a child. Any of your friends do that who aren't devotees? It's pretty rare, right? I mean, I don't know, maybe they do in South India. Do they? Does anybody do that anymore?
Yes.
The Garbhodhan Samskar?
I don't know the...
Garbhodhan Samskar.
Yes, in fact, one of the devotees, I don't know her name, but she was...
Devotees, not talking... But what about non-devotees? Non-devotees? That's a symptom of Kali Yuga. There's no Garbhodhan Samskar. So that's why everyone's Shudra or less. Because the Garbhodhan Samskar then will qualify people into higher varnas. So, if you follow that principle, then even bringing children into the world is not sense gratification. So in that sense, we can say, in the life of devotee, there is no sense gratification. But in another sense, you can say, well, I eat, that's sense gratification. I sleep, that's sense gratification. I'm married, that's sense gratification. I make money, that's sense gratification. You can say that. But if you're only doing it to fulfill needs that are necessary for you to fulfill so you can engage in devotional service, how is that sense gratification? Because you're not doing it for yourself, right? Does that make sense? So in that sense, even sense gratification is not sense gratification, right? If it's done according to your need and it facilitates bhakti, there is no sense gratification, even if there is sense gratification, right? So let's say he's a brahmachari, he's happy living in a room with 4 other men, and that's all he needs. So that's all the sense gratification he needs. So any more than that would be too much. That would be sense gratification. But someone else needs more than him. And so when they engage in more sense gratification than him, but it's what they need and they're only doing it in order to do their service, then even that is not sense gratification. It would be sense gratification for him, but not for him. Right? So what is sense gratification for one is not necessarily sense gratification for somebody else. And what's austerity for one is not necessarily austere for... So he gets up at 2 o'clock every day, but for him, that's austere. But for him, it's natural. He always got up early, even when he was a student. And so austerity for him is 1:30. Austerity for him is 4 o'clock. Right? You understand? So it's relative. So, in that sense, we can say there's no sense gratification. There is no factor which is sense gratification other than gratifying yourself beyond what you need. Right? So, if you don't need to be married, you can be happy as a brahmachari. Then marriage becomes sense gratification. If you cannot maintain brahmachari life, you need to be married. Then the austerity of brahmachari becomes an impediment. Then there's too much austerity. You need Prabhu. You need more sense gratification. You don't have enough. Sounds weird, doesn't it? To tell someone you need more, but it's actually true. No, Prabhu, you need to be married. No, Prabhu, you don't need to be married. You need more sense gratification. You're too austere. You're going to crack. Someday you're going to break down. You won't be able to maintain it. You can't maintain that level. Right? I'll tell you a story. Well, it's such an interesting story. There was a devotee who thought he was going to die. He was diagnosed, I don't know with what. But he was told he was going to die, like in a few months. So he wrote Prabhupada and said, Prabhupada, I'm going to die. Can I take Babaji? You know, Babaji, you only eat if people bring you food. And you just wear a gamcha, a white gamcha. and you sleep on the floor. Really difficult. And then, if nobody brings you food, you don't eat. So I was actually living next to him in the temple. And people would bring a plate, they would put it in front of the door, and they would knock on the door, and he'd open it, and he would take it and eat it, and then he'd put the plate out. And if they didn't knock, he wouldn't eat. And he was just chanting all day. So who knows how many rounds he was chanting. He was just chanting and reading. But I'm sure he was chanting in the 90s or 100s. And, so he left his wife living like a Babaji. And I don't know the details, but he got better. So what do you think he did when he got better? Upped it to 128, 164, 192, eating once every 3 days? No, he went back with his wife. Because he's going to live. Right? So that was the first and the last and the only devotee Prabhupada gave Babaji to, and the Babaji experiment had failed. Definitely proved that, at least amongst Westerners, we're not ready for Babaji. Sometimes we'll see a brahmachari. He's rough and tough. Some brahmacharis are rough and tough. And one way they're rough and tough is they really, really don't like to get within 2 miles of any woman. It really bothers them. If a woman comes too close, it's like, stay away, Mataji. I'm a brahmachari. Of course I'm exaggerating, but you understand the picture. And some devotees will see that brahmachari is very, very averse to women, almost like angry averse. And some devotees will think he needs to get married because the aversion is a sign of attraction. So, sometimes you'll actually tell somebody you need more sense gratification. Here, how you can't maintain your austerity. But no one's going to tell a brahmachari to get married if they see he can do it. Then nobody would say that. There's no need for it. Right? Continue with your austerity. It's really good. Continue it. Increase it if you can. So that's funny. Right? But sometimes we'll tell people, you're not getting enough sense gratification. Probably you should eat more. You're not eating enough. I think you should have a sweet every day. Because you could see, maybe it's too austere. They're agitated. They're not happy or something. Their life's too difficult. So that's the idea. Enough sense gratification so that you can be steady. But again, we don't call it sense gratification because you're only doing it up to the level of what you need, not more than that. Right? And that's different for everybody. Now, as strange or funny as it sounds, some devotees need a lot more than other devotees. It's their samskara, the way they were raised. And if they don't have a lot, they don't feel peaceful. So the idea is when you're young, you fulfill your needs, and when you're older, you renounce. And sometimes if you don't fulfill yourself materially when you're younger, you can't renounce when you're older, because you're still hankering for the things that you never had. So therefore the idea is you fulfill yourself when you're younger, but you do it in a regulated way, in a restricted way. But you do it enough so that when you're 65, you don't think, oh, I never had this or I never had that. And I read something interesting. It was a conversation with a sannyasi in the Sri Sampradaya. And in that Sampradaya and the followers of Madhvacharya also, you may know that often young boys take sannyas. They're highly qualified, or at least they seem to be qualified. So they might take sannyas when they're 14, something like that. And what they found with these sannyasis is that the most dangerous period in their life is not youth, it's after 50. And you know why? Because they weren't fulfilled when they were younger. And so when you get to that age of 50, that's when it all hits you. So you would think that, the dangerous time is the 20s, right? 20, early 30s. Getting in the late 30s, it's easing up, 40. Then you would think every decade after that would be easier. And they found 50 to 65. If they're unfulfilled, it comes up then. And you're thinking, why so old? They said, well, they can still do it. They're not old, they're not like 86. That's too old. No, 50, you can still do it. You still get married and have kids. So I thought that was very interesting. So it's an example of what can happen if you don't get enough sense gratification. You're not fulfilled, and then when you want to renounce, when you're older, you can't renounce because you never fulfilled your need. So that's the idea of sense gratification. Fulfill your needs in a way so you can renounce. And that Grihastha life. Grihastha life is all about dealing with sexual desire. How do you deal with it? Well, you can deal with it by being brahmachari. But if you can't be brahmachari, you have to deal with it through Grihastha life. That's just how you do it. It's the reality. Right? That's the facility. If you can't control it, then you have facility. Grihastha life. And it's meant to purify. That's just another way to purify the desire. One way is abstain, and one way is to engage it and then purify. So those are the two processes of purification: renunciation and the engagement of your senses, and satisfying them away, satisfying them in Krishna consciousness, and then detaching later. So if you remain brahmachari all your life, you're detached all your life. But if you get married, eventually when you're older, you'll come to the position basically of living like a brahmachari, or very close to it, because you'll renounce and you'll live simple. Does that make sense? Yes, so you have questions? Or doubts? Or arguments? Challenges? Yes?
Can we consider reduction in sense gratification as a sign of real advancement in spirituality?
Can we consider the reduction of sense as a sign? Yes. At the same time, we have to go back to the other point. Everybody has a different nature. So, reduction, let's look at it relatively. Relative to you, yes. But relative to him next to you, he may be more renounced. So you can't get to his level, but you have reduced it. But it should come naturally as a byproduct of bhakti. Sometimes people reduce sense gratification out of frustration. They have a bad experience. And they're not actually renounced. It's just, they're pained. When the pain goes away, they engage in it again. So the renunciation should definitely come from advancement, not just from frustration. I try to enjoy it, I can't, so I give it up. That's Mayavad. But the taste still remains somewhere. Prabhupada said, sex desire, that's the way you know you're advancing, it's reducing. At the same time, if we expect it to reduce more quickly than is reasonable for us, we could become discouraged. So you have to have some patience. You see, here's the confusing point. If you're getting a taste in Krishna consciousness, you naturally want to renounce. But you may sometimes renounce beyond a level you can maintain. It's just that for a particular period of time, you may be very inspired in your spiritual life. So you're more renounced and you think, I can maintain this all my life. Maybe you can, but there are cases when you can't. And so you have to know. It's just circumstantial. We went to Vrindavan, I'm very ecstatic, I think, I'm ready to renounce this and that. Then you get back in your routine and you might realize, yes, I am, or no, I'm not. So I think that's important. When I was, how old was I? 23 maybe? Or definitely by 24. I wrote Prabhupada and I said I want to take sannyas. So I thought I was ready at 24 to take sannyas. I wasn't, I didn't know. But I found out later I wasn't. But so sometimes you don't know, you overestimate your renunciation. So you don't want to do that. You know, I had a good week, so I'm ready for sannyas. Something like that. I was really inspired this week, you know. So-and-so Maharaj came, I want to be like him. You know, I'm 24, I've got a kid, I'm going to take sannyas. So you have to distinguish between the mercy that you're getting and the actual level you're on. Because sometimes you get mercy and it makes you feel like you're on a higher level because you're experiencing a lot of Krishna consciousness. So, but there's a difference between the experience and the level you're on, because the level is the steadiness. When all the smoke clears, that's where you land. You know what I mean? But so you might be flying up here, but when the smoke clears, you're going to land, and you have to always be aware of where you're going to land, and then you can evaluate how you're doing. So like you say, yeah, it is a symptom, but it should be natural and steady, stable. That's important. If it's not stable, then you can't say I'm renounced, and that is also a sign of an immature state of bhakti. You go up and down. You know, this week I'm ready to conquer the world, and this week I can't get out of bed. You know, that scenario. So, Madhurya Kadambini talks about that. In certain neophyte stage of bhakti or an immature stage, it can be a bit like a roller coaster. You're getting all the bliss, you know, of all the association, but on your own you're not that strong. And so we want to be realistic about how strong we are, so we know what we can renounce in a steady way. But definitely as you advance, you will become more renounced. Naturally, you won't even have to try. You know, when I first came into touch with Krishna consciousness, I wasn't following any of the principles. Well, I wasn't gambling, but the other ones I was not following perfectly. And by chanting and studying the Gita, I ended up following them, and I wasn't trying to follow them. I just ended up following them. So that's how it works. And if you've renounced steadily and you're going back into the things you renounced, then you realize that's a problem. What's the word? When you turn around? I'm degressing. Or I can't think. I'm too tired to think right now. Some word like that. What else?
Mayavad philosophy says that Krishna is formless. So like I was reading the book, I don't know. So reading the book, like Krishna, there is no difference between Krishna and his sound vibration form. Right? So sound vibration form is formless, right?
He's quite a philosopher. He said, Mayavad philosophy is Krishna's formless. Krishna's his name, and his sound vibration of his name is formless. So what's going on here? What's going on is that Nama Rupa Guna Lila, all the Rupa Guna Lila are contained within the name. So a pure devotee, when he chants Krishna, he sees Krishna. So from the material perspective, it's just sound. But from the spiritual perspective, it's Krishna. And someday you'll realize that. I don't know when I can't put the date on the calendar, but if you keep going and you don't make offenses to the holy name, someday you'll realize that. So it is the form. It's just the transcendental is not limited by the material. So materially the sound is nothing. It's just a sound that represents an object. But spiritually the sound is the object. So you'll realize it by change. If it wasn't, how could you be purified by chanting? If that wasn't Krishna. So Prabhupada said, the Bhagavatam is also Krishna. You know, there's a purport. This is an amazing purport. I don't know if it's so amazing, but for conditioned souls it's quite amazing. The Prabhupada said, there is no difference between reading the Bhagavatam and meeting Krishna personally. And you're thinking, come on, meeting him would be so much better than reading the Bhagavatam. Right? Wouldn't it? Don't you think? I mean, it's just reading Bhagavatam, it's not that great. But if I could see Krishna, it would be great. But Prabhupada's saying, you can see Krishna in the pages of the Bhagavatam. But, you know, it takes some purification to have that experience. But he's saying, there is no difference. The Shastra is saying the name is Krishna, there is no difference. So for now, before you fully realize it, you just have to accept it. And Prabhupada said, it's not something you can understand intellectually. It's only something you can experience. So the more you try to understand it, wait a minute, it's a sound, it's a vibration, it's a material element, it's sound. That's not, and it's formless. I mean, maybe there's a waveform that measures it, but basically it's formless. It's not going to make sense. So Prabhupada is saying you accept it, you apply it in practice. In deity worship you apply it, in chanting you apply it, and you'll realize it through application. Jagannath came to San Francisco, I think 1967 or 1968. So you know Jagannath is an interesting deity, right? So you imagine you're bringing Jagannath to America, and they don't know what deities are. So then they carve Jagannath, and the Prophet says, well, there's Krishna, there's his sister Subhadra, and there's his brother Balaram. That doesn't make sense to us. And they're personally present, and you have to feed them and wake them up and put them to sleep. So the Americans are like, wait a minute. But we had faith in Prabhupada. So we did it. And by doing it, we realized that Krishna is there, and actual attachment developed. So that's the idea. Sometimes you can't understand something, but you just have to follow the instruction, and then you'll get the realization by following. So Prabhupada actually said, intellectually you can't understand that the name of Krishna and Krishna are the same. You know, you just think about it, it's like you can't relate it to anything. There's no experience. He said, but you can realize it. So you have to approach the name as it's Krishna, not as it's a sound. That represents Krishna. It is Krishna. That's how to approach it. Then you'll be okay. Is that alright? You could try it. Try it and see what happens. And speaking of sense gratification, the greatest sense gratification is chanting the holy name. Because when you actually realize Krishna is there, it doesn't get any better than that. You're with Krishna anytime you chant. So yeah, okay, this is a good point. We do have sense gratification in Krishna consciousness, but it's transcendental. And it's around pleasing Krishna's senses. And that gives us pleasure. So our sense gratification is really great. It's really high level. It's transcendental sense gratification. So we do have a lot of sense gratification. Definitely. You see the deities, gratify your eyes, you hear the holy name, the Bhagavatam, your ears, prasadam, your tongue. You hug the devotees, the sense of touch. Smell the flowers. So we've got all our senses covered. So we have all kinds of sense gratification. But it's transcendental sense gratification. Because you don't go around smelling flowers and eating food that's not offered. Right? I mean, you shouldn't. else? What's next, prasadam? That's why you're not asking questions. Hold up the prasadam, serve out. Sometimes it's true. We have a question here. I often fall into the first place to finish japa or get up early to prepare. Anything else? Should I ask you a question? I have a question. One time Prabhupada said, any questions? No one had a question. He said, what, you know everything? He wanted questions because, Bhagavatam is just questions and answers. So he wanted to keep the kata going. So I was like, you don't ask questions. There he is, my man. Okay, thank you very much. Oh, you have a question.
We all are born in deep ignorance, and
Yes.
Bhagavatam is the only light and the only way by which we can realize Lord. Or there are other scriptures which are the other way of reaching the Lord.
Yeah, there are other scriptures. Bhagavatam is exalted for Vaishnavas. Is the most powerful. And there are other books, there are other Puranas, different modes of nature. But the Bhagavatam is the most pure. Everything in Bhagavatam is just going to give you pure devotional service. That's what it's aimed for. And other Puranas will give you that, but they'll give you other things. It's not so condensed and focused.
So Christians and Muslims cannot reach Lord?
Well, they definitely won't reach Krishna in Vrindavan. Because they don't know that. I can't predict exactly, but I can give the general principle is that whatever form of the Lord you worship, that's where you go. Provided you're actually worshiping Him and you're not committing sin. So you go to Jesus. You go to Vishnu if you worship Vishnu. I'm not an expert on Islam, so but let's say for the sake of discussion, then you go to Allah. Allah. In that form. And that's a general idea. The form that you're worshipping, that's where you go. To the planet of that deity. And if there is no planet of that deity, then I'm not sure where you go. Someone asked a question if Buddha has his own planet. Does anybody know? If Lord Buddha has his own planet? Is that described anywhere? I was assuming he did. Yes? No? Any evidence, one way or the other?
Only mercy and compassion.
No planet?
No.
His form's not eternal? No. Jiva Tattva? Yeah. So if he doesn't have a place, then the question would be, where do the Buddhas go?
Nirvana. Nirvana is the word.
Sunya, Shunya. Yanti Deva Vrta Deva, Pitri Yanti Jivatava. You go where you worship. The thing is, it's not that we're saying you can't be spiritually advanced if you don't have Bhagavatam. We're saying is without Bhagavatam, how will you know what is pure bhakti? How will you know what is Vrindavan? How will you know who is Shyamasundar? So, if you know those things, you can go to Brajendu Kumar in Vrindavan. If you don't know, you can't go. You go to some other form of God.
So taking birth in a Vaishnava family is a very auspicious thing.
It's very auspicious, but taking birth in a Malacha family in America in 1950 is also auspicious, because then when you're a teenager you can meet Prabhupada. And it may be more auspicious, because it depends what kind of Vaishnavi family you were born in and what they do and so on. And it depends what you do. You may take it for granted and give it up. So, the answer to the question is, good fortune is like a push, but it doesn't mean you take advantage of it. Just because you're born in a good situation doesn't mean you take advantage of it. Just because you're born in a bad situation doesn't mean you won't take advantage. Right? So, when I hear about all the family problems that are common in India, I'm very happy I wasn't born in India. I don't have to deal with that. I just told my parents I'm becoming a devotee. My mother's crying, and I just go, who cares for you? And I leave. An Indian boy can never do that. Right? Once his mother cries, that's it. Forget moving in the ashram. But for us as Americans, it's like, she'll cry about something or other. What does it matter? This is what I'm going to do. So they also have that blessing. So anytime a devotee comes to me and says, my mother-in-law this, my father that, my husband this, the uncle this, the aunt this whole intrigue that, to me it sounds like a TV serial, but it's real life. And they go, bless me, I can deal with this. I go, bless you in your next life. You're not born an Indian. You'll never have to deal with this again. Funny but true sometimes. No, there's one more thing also is really interesting. I was at this lecture, and Prabhupada said, you should go back to Godhead in this lifetime. And he said, there were 2 reasons you should do it. He said, Kali Yuga is getting bad very quickly. You don't want to be here. And the second reason he gave was, there's no guarantee that in your next life you'll continue your bhakti. Maybe you won't. Maybe you'll take birth in a really wealthy family. And you'll look at the Hare Krishnas and think, losers. I would never get within 100 miles of these guys. They're just proud as anything because you're in this prestigious family and situation. So he said that could happen. He was trying to make the point there's no guarantee. I mean, it's nice, probably you will be Krishna conscious if you're born in a devotee family, but he said you never know. Independence is always there. Right? You agree? Yes. People say, Prabhupada said this, Prabhupada said that. I was in the class when he said it, so he definitely said it. Unless I was hallucinating, but that's what I heard. Yeah.
Can you tell from your spiritual journey what is the biggest challenge you have faced in your spiritual life? How you overcame?
Biggest challenge, I think, is being humble and sexual attraction. And they go together. They're kind of part of the same thing. Proud, not needing to be honored, not seeing the opposite sex in exploitive ways, or also not misusing power that's given. Like, it's easy to be humble when you have nothing. Prabhu, this devotee is really humble. Yeah, it's like, he doesn't even have a bicycle. He lives in a tin shed. That's why he's humble. Put him in a palace in a BMW, This guy will be a terror. So being able to handle power, being able to handle resources, that's a challenge. Yes.
I just want to know what one point he said about going back to God in this life. It said that you have no guarantee that next life you perform bhakti. The other point,
Oh, the Kali Yuga is going to be so bad, you don't want to come back and see it. You come back to Bangalore in your next life, there'll be like 28 million people living here. So you think it's bad now, right? Yes? Can you imagine being born in Bangalore 50 years from now? How crowded it's going to be? Oh my God. And what the culture is going to be like? So that's what Prabhupada's saying, don't come back. But the interesting thing is, let's do some math. This is the interesting part of him saying, don't come back. He said it in 1972. So I was 22 in 1972. So Prabhupada's saying, don't come back. Let's say, average man dies like 75 or let's say 78. So 1972, I'm 22, so 78 would be 56 more years. So 56 years from 1972, what is it? Who can give me the date? 2028. So Prabhupada's saying, let's just say for the sake of making this more real, you don't want to come back because by 2028 it's going to be really bad. So most of you are going to live through that period of Prabhupada saying how bad it's going to get. I think it already happened quicker than he predicted. But if things continually get worse at the same rate and speed, then 2028 is going to be pretty bad. Another 10 years. Right?
So how do you know when you became pure?
How do you know when you're pure? Because you're pure. You know that Prabhu, when I eat, how do I know I'm full? Well, you ask the waiter, am I full? I probably give that example. Someone said, how do you know when you're liberated? I said, you'll know. You don't ask the waiter whether you're full. But if you want to evaluate your purity on your present level, one evaluation is your detachment. How selfish you are, how attached to sense gratification you are, these things. How controlled are you, how humble are you, compassionate, like that. The most important thing is what's your motive? Why are you serving? I mean, you may not be the most humble person. Maybe in 50 years you'll develop humility. But right now, maybe the most important question is, what's your motivation? How do you know I'm pure? I know I'm pure because my motive to serve Krishna is pure. How do I know I'm impure? Because my motive is impure. I want to gain a position, I want to get respect, I want to impress this one and that one. Maybe I can extract money, so many things. So you know you're pure when your motive is, I just want to serve to please. Yes?
How to purify our motive?
Very good question. That's an interesting question. He's asking how to purify your motive. Can you give me the answer? I mean, one standard answer is just practice Krishna consciousness. But even doing that, you have control of your motive. You read Prabhupada's